What would you do if you walked into your house and found your wife bent over by your own brother? 3 children that weren't yours, 1 that was, and a DNA test that exposed years of betrayal. Jason Smith was a man of faith, a devoted pastor, and a man who built his life on the principles of love, trust, and forgiveness. But his world was shattered in the most unimaginable way when the truth about his family unraveled, leading to a moment of blinding rage that would leave 2 people dead and a community stunned. Before we dive into this heart-wrenching story of betrayal, lies, and murder, make sure to like this video and subscribe to Shocking True Crime Stories. You won't believe how this one ends. This is the story of how the relationship between 2 brothers, Jason Smith and Jeremiah Smith, took a devastating turn, shattering a bond that once seemed unbreakable. Raised in a fatherless home in a rough North Carolina neighborhood, the Smith brothers grew up relying on each other for survival. Their mother worked tirelessly to make ends meet, leaving Jason, the elder of the 2, to shoulder the responsibility of looking after Jeremiah. Jason Smith, calm and grounded, had a natural sense of leadership and compassion, stepping into the role of protector for his younger brother. His faith became his anchor, giving him a moral foundation that would shape the rest of his life. Jason's journey took him to the heart of the church. Determined to make a difference in the world, he began preaching in his early 20s, eventually founding a small ministry that quickly grew into a thriving community of worshipers. It was at one of his services that Jason first met Veronica Hayes. She was stunning, tall, graceful, with an effortless charm that caught his eye from the moment she entered the church. Jason, who had always focused more on his faith than romance, found himself drawn to her in a way he had never felt before. Veronica came from a nearby town and had joined Jason's church on the recommendation of a friend. Raised in a devout Christian family, she was admired for her striking beauty and warm demeanor. But life hadn't been easy for Veronica. Beneath her composed exterior, she struggled with insecurities, yearning for stability in admiration. Jason's kindness and genuine nature immediately stood out to her, and their connection grew quickly. Jason courted Veronica with sincerity, showering her with thoughtful gestures and meaningful conversations. He introduced her to his mother, who adored her, and even brought her into the church's inner circle, where she became an active member of the congregation. Veronica admired Jason's dedication to his faith and his ability to lead with compassion and strength. For Jason, Veronica was everything he had ever hoped for, a partner who supported his ministry, shared his values, and brought joy to his life. Their relationship blossomed, and within a year, Jason proposed to Veronica in front of the congregation during a Sunday service. It was a moment of pure joy, one that solidified their bond and earned them the admiration of the community. They were married in a beautiful ceremony surrounded by family, friends, and members of the church. Jason believed he had found his happily ever after, a wife who shared his faith and a life centered around love and purpose. Jeremiah Smith, however, struggled to follow Jason's example. While Jason found solace and purpose in the church, Jeremiah found himself consumed by the streets, angered by their father's absence and the financial struggles of their household. He became reckless, falling into a life of crime. Petty thefts turned into breaking and entering, and eventually, he got involved with a group of troublemakers who often ran afoul of the law. For Jeremiah, the thrill of rebellion was a way to cope with his frustrations, but for Jason, it was a constant source of worry. Their mother, overwhelmed by Jeremiah's behavior, often turned to Jason, hoping he could guide his younger brother back onto the right path. The breaking point came when Jeremiah Smith, in his early 20s, was arrested for burglary. It was a defining moment for both brothers. Jason Smith, now a young pastor trying to grow his ministry, had been saving every penny for the future of his church. But when he received the call from the police station, he didn't hesitate. Using the money he had painstakingly put aside, Jason bailed Jeremiah out of jail. It wasn't just an act of generosity, it was a lifeline, a chance for Jeremiah to start over. That moment marked a turning point in Jeremiah Smith's life. Deeply moved by Jason's unwavering support, he began attending church services regularly, where Jason mentored him closely. Slowly but surely, Jeremiah transformed. He gave his life to faith, vowing to leave his old ways behind. His testimony of redemption resonated with the congregation, and he quickly became a vital part of Jason's ministry. Jeremiah ran youth programs, helped with outreach events, and used his street smarts to connect with people Jason couldn't always reach. For a while, it seemed as though the brothers had found harmony, working side by side to build a community rooted in faith and love. But beneath Jeremiah's reformed exterior, resentment began to fester. The more he worked alongside Jason, the more he saw the stark contrast between their lives. Jason Smith had a stable career, the respect of the community, and a picture-perfect family. Jeremiah Smith, on the other hand, still carried the scars of his past, feeling like an outsider in a world that viewed Jason as a hero. The jealousy was subtle at first, a pang of bitterness when Jason was praised at church or a flash of irritation when someone compared him to his older brother. But it grew, slowly eating away at him. Jeremiah couldn't help but notice Veronica. Her beauty captivated him, and though he would never admit it, a seed of jealousy began to grow in his heart. As Jason and Veronica began their married life, Jeremiah felt increasingly like an outsider looking in, fueling his resentment. While Jason spent long hours at the church, Veronica began to feel neglected. Jeremiah, who had become an integral part of Jason's ministry, found himself spending more time with Veronica, helping with family errands and offering a listening ear. Over time, the bond between them deepened, crossing boundaries that neither of them should have crossed. The affair between Jeremiah Smith and Veronica Smith began with an incident that neither of them could have predicted would spiral into years of betrayal. It was a warm Sunday afternoon after church service. Jason had been pulled into a last-minute meeting with the church's board members, leaving Veronica and Jeremiah to manage the cleanup from a congregation luncheon. The church kitchen was bustling with volunteers, but somehow, Jeremiah and Veronica found themselves alone in the back storage room, organizing supplies. Veronica had just lifted a heavy box of canned goods when it slipped from her hands, scattering cans across the floor. Jeremiah rushed over, laughing as he bent down to help. "You're too fancy to be doing the heavy lifting," he teased, flashing his signature grin. Veronica laughed in return, brushing a strand of hair out of her face, her cheeks flushed from the exertion. "Blame your brother," she joked. "He had me helping out with everything before I even had a chance to sit down." Jeremiah smirked. "Sounds about right. Jason always did like putting people to work." The light-hearted banter continued as they cleaned up, but something unspoken lingered in the air. Veronica couldn't ignore the way Jeremiah's presence felt different, less formal than Jason, more playful, more exciting. Jeremiah, on the other hand, found himself drawn to her confidence and beauty. As they stood there, only inches apart, Veronica looked up at Jeremiah, their eyes locking for a brief moment too long. It was subtle, but in that instant, a line was crossed. From then on, their interactions began to shift. What were once innocent conversations turned into lingering glances and subtle touches. Jeremiah began finding excuses to help Veronica with small tasks around the church or at home, especially when Jason was busy. Whether it was running errands with her or offering to help fix something at the house, Jeremiah gradually worked his way into her everyday life. The incident that solidified their affair came a few months later. Jason had left for a 3-day spiritual retreat with other pastors, leaving Veronica alone at home. Jeremiah offered to come over and check on her, claiming he wanted to make sure she didn't need help with anything. Veronica hesitated at first, knowing how easily gossip could spread, but eventually agreed. That evening, Jeremiah showed up with dinner in hand, jokingly calling himself the backup husband. They shared a meal, laughing and talking as if nothing was out of the ordinary. After dinner, Veronica mentioned a squeaky hinge on the back door, and Jeremiah offered to fix it. While he worked, Veronica poured them both a glass of wine, something Jason rarely indulged in. As the evening wore on, the conversation turned more personal. Jeremiah shared stories of his past struggles, his regrets, and how much Jason's faith had saved him. Veronica found herself opening up about her frustrations, how she sometimes felt overlooked in Jason's world of ministry, how she longed for more spontaneity and attention. "I don't think Jason realizes how lucky he is," Jeremiah said softly, his gaze lingering on her. "You deserve more than to just be part of his schedule." Veronica looked at him, unsure how to respond. "He's just focused. That's all." "Focused on everything but you," Jeremiah said, stepping closer. The tension between them was palpable. Veronica tried to brush it off with a nervous laugh, but when Jeremiah reached out to touch her hand, she didn't pull away. One moment led to another, and before they knew it, they had crossed a line that could never be undone. From that night on, their affair became a dangerous secret. They arranged stolen moments whenever Jason was busy with the church, each meeting filled with a mix of guilt and desire. Jeremiah couldn't get enough of Veronica, often telling her that no one would ever understand her like he did. Veronica, drawn to the excitement and attention she felt was missing from her marriage, allowed the affair to continue, rationalizing it as something she needed to feel alive. What started as a seemingly innocent bond had now spiraled into a betrayal so deep that it would tear the Smith family apart in ways they could never imagine. Jason and Veronica quickly built a family, welcoming their first child, David, within a year of their wedding. Jason threw himself into fatherhood with the same dedication he brought to his ministry, believing he was creating the perfect life. Over the next few years, their family grew to include 3 more children, Jordan, Elijah, and Sophia. Jason's life seemed ideal, a devoted wife, 4 beautiful children, and a thriving church. Jason's suspicions didn't come out of nowhere, they began after a seemingly innocent comment during a family gathering. It was a Sunday afternoon after church, and the family had gathered in the backyard for a barbecue. Jeremiah, as usual, was the center of attention, playfully chasing the kids while Veronica looked on, laughing. Jason was standing off to the side, enjoying the scene, when one of the church members, Sister Elaine, approached him with a curious smile. "You know, Pastor Jason, Jordan and Elijah are the spitting image of Jeremiah when he was their age," she said casually. "It's almost uncanny." Jason laughed it off, nodding politely, but the comments stuck with him. Later that evening, as the family gathered for prayer, Jason couldn't help but study his children's faces more closely. Jordan and Elijah, especially, did have features that reminded him of his brother, their wide smiles, the tilt of their heads when they were thinking. But then again, wasn't that to be expected? After all, Jason and Jeremiah were brothers, and family resemblance wasn't unusual. Still, a seed of doubt had been planted, and it grew as Jason began noticing subtle changes in Veronica's behavior. She had become distant, distracted during their conversations, and more protective of her phone, which she always kept within arm's reach. Jason also noticed that Jeremiah seemed to linger more often when he came over to visit, finding reasons to stay late or accompany Veronica on errands that didn't require his help. The moment that tipped Jason over the edge came during a hospital visit. Sophia, their youngest, had fallen off the swing at the playground and required stitches for a cut on her forehead. While filling out the intake forms, the nurse asked Jason for some basic family medical history. "Does either parent have any history of allergies or conditions we should be aware of?" she asked. Jason replied quickly, listing what he knew about his and Veronica's family health histories. Then the nurse added, "What about the children's uncle? It's common for allergies or conditions to run in siblings and close relatives, so it's good to know." Jason hesitated for a moment. "Well, Jeremiah's history shouldn't matter here." "Why would it?" The nurse gave a polite smile. "Well, just in case. Sometimes traits and risks can skip around the family tree." Her comment was innocent enough, but it stuck with Jason as he watched the nurse bandage Sophia's wound. That nagging thought returned, did the children share more in common with Jeremiah than with him? The idea began eating away at him. Jason finally decided to act. But instead of jumping to a DNA test right away, he used his medical connections to dig deeper. During a routine pediatric appointment, Jason casually mentioned wanting to better understand their children's genetic health. He requested a full genetic profile for all 4 kids, citing a desire to prepare for any hereditary risks in the family. When the results came back, Jason's heart sank. While the profiles didn't explicitly confirm paternity, they showed a clear mismatch between his genetic markers and those of 3 of his children. David, their eldest, shared enough traits with Jason to confirm him as the biological father. But Jordan, Elijah, and Sophia? Their profiles didn't align with Jason's in critical ways. The report strongly suggested that someone closely related to Jason, likely a sibling, was their biological father. The realization hit Jason like a freight train. The only possible explanation was Jeremiah. There was no other relative who could account for the connection. Jason didn't want to believe it, but the pieces began falling into place. Veronica's distance, Jeremiah's growing presence in their lives, and the subtle resemblance between his brother and his children, it all made sense now. Jason kept the genetic report to himself for weeks, torn between denial and anger. He prayed for clarity, for strength, for an explanation that could make this nightmare go away. But no matter how much he tried to rationalize it, the betrayal became undeniable. His brother. His wife. His family. The foundation of his life was built on a lie, and now Jason was left to decide what to do with the truth. It was a Sunday morning like no other, and Jason was preparing to deliver one of the most important sermons of his career at a large crusade. But unlike other Sundays, Jason's mind was clouded by the DNA test results that had shattered his world just days earlier. Only one of his 4 children was biologically his. The other 3 were fathered by Jeremiah, his own brother. The betrayal weighed heavily on his heart, and though he tried to focus on his message for the day, his anger simmered just beneath the surface. Veronica had been unusually quiet that morning, claiming she wasn't feeling well and insisting that she stay home to rest. Jason, watching her closely, felt his suspicions deepen. For weeks, he had noticed her distant behavior and her guarded phone conversations. He knew something was wrong, and now, with the results confirming his worst fears, Jason was determined to confront her. But not yet. He needed time to process how to approach the conversation, and he didn't want to alarm the children. "I'll be fine," Veronica said softly, offering a faint smile as she adjusted her robe. "Just go. You have a big day ahead of you." Jason kissed her forehead, the gesture mechanical and void of his usual warmth. "I'll be back after the crusade," he said flatly, his eyes lingering on her longer than usual. He was looking for something, guilt, fear, or even a crack in her facade, but Veronica met his gaze with practiced ease, betraying nothing. Gathering his sermon notes, Jason left the house with the children. The drive to church was filled with the usual chatter from the kids, their voices cutting through the storm of thoughts in Jason's mind. He smiled at them, masking his inner turmoil, but every time he glanced in the rearview mirror, he couldn't help but wonder, were these truly his children? Could they feel the tension, the shift in their father's demeanor? At the church, Jason dropped the children off with the Sunday school staff. As they ran off to join their friends, Jason paused, gripping the steering wheel tightly before heading inside. He had rehearsed this sermon dozens of times, but now, every word felt hollow. How could he stand in front of his congregation and preach about faith, trust, and forgiveness when his own life was a web of lies and betrayal? As he prepared backstage, Jason realized he had forgotten an important section of his sermon notes at home. The oversight, minor on any other day, felt monumental in the moment. He saw it as a sign, an opportunity. Perhaps now was the time to confront Veronica, to stop delaying the inevitable. With a nod to one of the staff members, Jason excused himself, telling them he'd be back shortly. As he pulled into the driveway, Jason noticed something that made his blood run cold. Jeremiah's car was parked a few houses down, partially hidden behind some trees. His heart began to pound as he stared at the familiar vehicle, the pieces clicking into place. Why was Jeremiah here on a Sunday morning, when he was supposed to be helping at the crusade? Jason's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white as he tried to steady his breathing. He stepped out of the car, every muscle in his body tense. Unlocking the front door, Jason entered the house, immediately noticing how quiet it was. Too quiet. The usual hum of the television or the faint sound of Veronica bustling around the kitchen was absent. Setting his keys down on the counter, Jason moved toward the hallway that led to their bedroom. As he approached, muffled sounds reached his ears, laughter, whispers, and then something unmistakable. A low groan. Jason froze in place, his heart racing. He knew what he was about to see, but the reality of it was too horrific to fully accept. He pushed the bedroom door open, and there it was. The final confirmation. Jeremiah, his younger brother, was behind Veronica, his hands gripping her hips as they moved together on the bed Jason had shared with her for years. Veronica's head was tilted back, her face a mixture of pleasure and shock as her eyes locked with Jason's. Jeremiah froze, his expression shifting from lust to terror in an instant. For a moment, the room felt frozen in time. Jason's vision blurred with rage, his chest heaving as he stood in the doorway, staring at the two people who had destroyed his life. Without a word, he turned and stormed out of the room, heading straight for the kitchen. His mind was a storm of anger, betrayal, and heartbreak as he grabbed the largest knife from the block on the counter. This was no longer about the DNA test, the children, or even the years of lies. This was about the raw, unfiltered rage of a man whose world had been torn apart by the very people he trusted most. Knife in hand, Jason marched back toward the bedroom, his steps heavy with purpose, as the betrayal erupted into violence. Jeremiah barely had time to react before Jason lunged into the room, knife in hand. "Jason, wait!" Jeremiah shouted, his hands instinctively going up in defense, but it was too late. Jason's rage had consumed him. With a swift and forceful motion, he hurled the knife directly at Jeremiah, the blade piercing him just above his left eye. Jeremiah let out a guttural scream, stumbling backward and collapsing onto the bed as blood gushed from the wound. Veronica screamed, scrambling off the bed and backing into a corner, her face pale with terror. "Jason, please. Stop. It's not what you think," she cried, her voice trembling, but her words only fueled his fury. Jason turned his attention back to Jeremiah, who was writhing in pain, clutching at his bleeding face. "You betrayed me," Jason growled, his voice low and trembling with anger. "My own brother. My own family." He climbed onto the bed and began stabbing Jeremiah repeatedly, each blow driven by the weight of years of betrayal, lies, and shattered trust. Blood splattered across the room, painting the walls, the sheets, and Jason's own clothes in crimson. "Jason, stop." Veronica sobbed from the corner, but Jason was deaf to her pleas. He couldn't stop. He didn't want to stop. The knife rose and fell, over and over, until Jeremiah lay still, his body limp and lifeless beneath Jason's trembling hands. The room was silent except for Jason's ragged breathing as he stared down at what he had done. Then, slowly, he turned his gaze to Veronica. Her hands were clasped over her mouth, tears streaming down her face as she slid further into the corner. "Jason, I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I never meant for this to happen." Jason stood, blood dripping from his hands, his eyes locked on her. "You never meant for this to happen," he repeated, his voice rising with every word. "You lied to me. You cheated on me. You let him father my children, and you never meant for this to happen." Veronica shook her head, her sobs growing louder. "Please, Jason, we can fix this. I'll do whatever you want. Just, please don't hurt me." But Jason's mind was far beyond reason. All he could see was the betrayal, the years of lies, the family he thought he had built crumbling before his eyes. He stepped toward her, his bloodied hands trembling as he reached out. Veronica tried to scramble away, but there was nowhere to go. Jason grabbed her by the shoulders and dragged her to her feet. "You destroyed everything," he said through gritted teeth, his grip tightening. Veronica struggled, clawing at his arms, but Jason was unrelenting. His hands found their way to her neck, and before she could scream, he began to squeeze. Veronica's eyes widened in terror as she clawed at his hands, gasping for air. "Jason, please," she choked, but his grip only tightened. He lifted her off the ground, his strength fueled by his rage and heartbreak. Her struggles weakened as the life drained from her body, her arms falling limply to her sides. When her body finally went limp, Jason released her, letting her crumple to the floor next to Jeremiah. Jason stood there, his chest heaving, staring down at the two lifeless bodies that had once been the people closest to him. The room, once a place of love and trust, was now a blood-soaked scene of unimaginable violence. The reality of what he had done began to sink in, and Jason collapsed to his knees, his head in his hands. For several minutes, he sat there in silence, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like a crushing force. He thought of his children, waiting for him back at the church, blissfully unaware of the chaos that had just unfolded. He thought of his congregation, the people who looked up to him as a moral leader. And he thought of the life he had worked so hard to build, now reduced to nothing but blood and ashes. Finally, Jason reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. His fingers shook as he dialed 911. When the operator answered, Jason's voice was hollow, devoid of emotion. "I've killed them," he said simply. "My wife and my brother. They're dead." The operator tried to ask him questions, but Jason barely heard her. He gave the address, dropped the phone onto the floor, and sat back against the wall, staring blankly ahead as the sound of approaching sirens began to fill the air. The sound of sirens echoed through the neighborhood, growing louder with each passing second. Jason remained seated against the blood-streaked wall, his hands still trembling, his mind numb. The knife lay on the floor beside him, a stark reminder of the violence that had just unfolded. He didn't move, didn't try to clean himself or flee. He was resigned to what came next. When the police arrived, they found Jason sitting in the middle of the chaos, his eyes vacant as he stared at the bodies of Jeremiah and Veronica. Officers entered cautiously, their guns drawn, unsure of what they were walking into. Jason didn't resist as they approached him, their commands sharp and clear. "Put your hands up," one officer shouted. Jason slowly raised his hands, his bloodied palms facing outward, a silent surrender. "I'm not going anywhere," he said quietly. The officers cuffed him and led him out of the house. Neighbors had gathered outside, their faces a mix of curiosity and horror as they watched the respected pastor being placed in the back of a police car. Jason didn't look at them. His thoughts were elsewhere, on his children, on the years of betrayal, and on the irreversible choices he had made in a single moment of rage. As detectives processed the scene, the gravity of the crime became apparent. The blood-soaked bedroom, the lifeless bodies of Veronica and Jeremiah, and the chilling calmness of Jason's surrender painted a picture of a man pushed to the brink. The evidence was overwhelming, but the question remained, what had driven Jason Smith, a man known for his faith and compassion, to commit such a brutal act? During his interrogation, Jason confessed everything. He spoke about the DNA test, the years of suspicions, and the moment he walked into his bedroom to find his wife and brother together. His voice was devoid of emotion, as though he were recounting someone else's story. "I lost control," he said simply. "They destroyed everything I believed in. Everything I built my life around." The case quickly gained media attention, with headlines highlighting the shocking fall of a beloved pastor and the scandal that had led to his crime. The community was divided. Some saw Jason as a man pushed to his limits by unimaginable betrayal, while others condemned his actions as cold-blooded murder. In April 2024, Jason stood trial for the murders of Veronica and Jeremiah. The prosecution argued that while Jason's actions were fueled by rage, the killings were deliberate and not a momentary lapse in judgment. They pointed to the DNA test, which Jason had kept secret for weeks, as evidence that he had been stewing in anger and resentment long before the crime occurred. The defense, however, painted a different picture. They argued that Jason's actions were a crime of passion, driven by an overwhelming wave of betrayal and heartbreak when he walked in on his wife and brother in bed together. Witnesses from the church testified to Jason's character, describing him as a man of integrity who had devoted his life to helping others. The defense emphasized that Jason's reaction, while tragic, was not premeditated but a spontaneous act of rage fueled by the emotional weight of years of lies. Jason himself took the stand during the trial, his testimony raw and unfiltered. He admitted to the killings, his voice shaking as he recounted the moment he found Veronica and Jeremiah together. "I wasn't thinking," he said. "I was blinded by the pain, the betrayal. In that moment, I wasn't myself." The jury deliberated for 3 days before reaching a verdict. Jason was convicted of voluntary manslaughter rather than first-degree murder, a decision influenced by the defense's compelling argument of a crime of passion. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 15 years. In the aftermath of the trial, the community remained divided. Some saw Jason's sentence as too lenient, while others believed he had already suffered enough. Jason's children were placed in the care of family members, shielded from the media frenzy that surrounded the case. For Jason, the weight of his actions and the loss of his family became a life sentence of its own, one he would carry long after his time behind bars. As he began his term in prison, Jason spent his days reflecting on the choices that had led him there. His letters to his children, filled with remorse and a longing for forgiveness, painted the picture of a man grappling with the enormity of his actions. "I let my anger consume me," he wrote in one letter. "I failed you, and I failed myself. But I will spend the rest of my life seeking redemption for the pain I've caused." The story of Jason Smith remains a haunting reminder of how even the strongest bonds can be shattered by betrayal, and how unchecked rage can lead to irreparable tragedy. After the horrific crime that claimed their mother and uncle, Jason's 4 children, David, Jordan, Elijah, and Sophia, were thrust into a world of uncertainty and heartbreak. The tragedy left them not only without their parents but also in the midst of a public scandal that consumed their once stable lives. In the immediate aftermath of the murders, Child Protective Services stepped in to ensure the children's safety and emotional well-being. The court granted temporary custody to Jason's maternal aunt, Carolyn, a kind but firm woman who lived in a neighboring state. Carolyn had always been close to Jason and Jeremiah growing up, and she stepped in without hesitation to take on the responsibility of raising the children. The transition was anything but smooth. Our prayers and best wishes goes out to them. This case is a haunting reminder of how betrayal from those closest to us can destroy everything we hold dear. What started as a life built on faith and trust unraveled in the most violent way possible, leaving a family broken and a community shaken. What do you think? Was Jason's act one of uncontrollable rage, or was it a calculated response to betrayal? And how do you think years of deception could have been hidden for so long? If this story shocked you, make sure to like this video and subscribe to Shocking True Crime Stories. Stay tuned for more jaw-dropping cases that reveal the darkest sides of human relationships.